Good afternoon, and today we are going to be talking about the lessons from Fukushima. Big changes underway with Japan's ground self-defense forces. And to do that, we have in the studio a special guest, Colonel Grant Newsham, the United States Marine Corps, who is the U.S. Military Liaison Officer to the Japanese ground self-defense forces. And Colonel Newsham, it's nice to have you here.
Well, thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Just by way of introduction, so that our audience knows, Colonel Newsham is not based here in Hawaii. He is based in Japan, and that reminds me, I wanted to extend a warm aloha to all of our listeners in Japan, as well as other Asian countries who may be listening to this live broadcast on the internet. And I don't want to leave out our audience on the U.S. mainland, and so I wanted to say hello to all of you. And as many of you know, this week marks the second anniversary of the Great Tohoku earthquake, along with the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And it is a solemn time of remembrance for the thousands upon thousands of Japanese citizens who were lost in that disaster. And today what we want to do is explore with Colonel Newsham what these relief efforts were really like on the ground, because he was intimately involved in that work. And we really want to be probing towards asking the question, what else could have been done differently to maybe save some of those lives, and what are the lessons learned from the disaster response in this phenomenally successful Operation Tomodachi, in which the United States military, its various branches of service, were coordinating with the Japanese self-defense forces in trying to rescue people who were caught in that terrible tsunami. And now to get underway, Colonel Newsham, let me just ask you, so that our audience can appreciate this. As I recall, you had something to do with the military attaché role to the United States Embassy way back years ago. Am I correct?
That's right. It's long forgotten, but I was actually the first Marine attaché to the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. This was about the year 2000, so it only took us about 50 years to get one there.
50 years, we got it. Okay.
That's right. Better late than never.
Okay. And generally describe for our audience now, what is your current position?
What I do is I'm a reservist. I'm on active duty, and I am based in Tokyo as officially the Marine Forces Pacific Liaison Officer to the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force. So I am based in Tokyo with the objective of really explaining the Marine Corps to people who need it explained to them. We're not well known in Japan and in Tokyo, surprisingly, considering how long we've been there. Additionally, and it's sort of a follow-on from the Operation Tomodachi effort and the lessons learned, is I'm assisting in development of an amphibious capability in the Japan Self-Defense Force.
You just gave away the big secret of this radio show, but it's okay. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're listening, you heard the news squeak out that Japan is looking seriously and maybe taking some steps towards the development of an amphibious Marine Corps-like force or capability in the years to come.
That's right.
Something like that.
Yes, it's the initial steps towards that. But it is, as I said, it is a tie-in to the lessons learned from the disaster up in Tohoku.
Okay, let's go back to that time then, so that our audience can kind of appreciate how this came to be and the significance of it. This terrible 9.0 earthquake hits Japan, and you're not wearing the battle fatigues that you have on at this moment in the studio, are you? What kind of dress are you wearing?
Oh, that's right. I was in a suit.
You were in a suit, okay, and you're located where?
I was in central Tokyo in my office. I was a reservist, so I was in my civilian job for a financial company, and on the 17th floor of a tall building.
Okay, 17th floor, office building in Tokyo, earthquake hits, 9.0, what's it like?
It was by far the biggest one I'd ever heard. It was very sharp, loud shaking that we thought it would end after about 10 seconds. They always do. This one didn't. It went on for about 2 or 3 minutes. I thought there was at least a 50% chance this was the one that would bring the building down.
And with it, the rumored one that might bring all of Tokyo down.
That's
right?
correct.
I know
yes.
there was one like that back in the 1920s.
1924 or so.
Okay. All right, so this earthquake hits. By the way, folks, this program is coming at you live from the belly of the beast here in the basement of or ground floor near the waterfall in the Pioneer Plaza. And you can join the conversation by calling us at area code 808-296-5467. We are live. And if you've got a comment or question during the course of the show, we'd like to encourage you to join us. Earthquake hits, Colonel Newsham. Some hours or day or so later, you get the phone call.
That's right. It was the next day. I got a call from, actually, Hawaii, asking if I would come on active duty and be useful.
Okay. We'd like to have you join our team, something like that?
This wasn't quite a yes or no. It was...
You're on our team?
Yes, when can you come?
Okay. All right, so some short period of time transpires and you arrive up in the disaster area where?
In Sendai, which is about 200 miles north of Tokyo, and that was where the center of both the earthquake but also the relief activity was taking place.
Okay, and there was why was Sendai important? Why was that the center of the relief activity?
It was easy. It's by far the biggest airport, the biggest city, the best sort of communications and transportation links, although they had been hit very hard in Sendai as well.
What did that airport look like?
When I got there, I was flown up on an airplane, and the pilot told me beforehand, he said, this is like a science fiction movie. He said, imagine a giant spread about 3 feet of mud on everything, and then a lot of wood and debris. And then he picked up a bunch of toy cars, crumpled them up, as often as not with somebody in it, and threw them all over the landscape. And that is what it was like.
Boy.
And when I got there, it was a gray, cold, windy day.
And warm 70s or 80s here in Hawaii, and was it snowing?
It wasn't then, but it had been.
Okay, and we had thousands upon thousands of civilians out in that cold.
That's right. Anyone who was not smothered immediately, by definition, was out in the cold, and there were many people who couldn't move. And it got good and cold that night, below freezing. And in some cases, as I said, it did snow.
All right, there's a difference in the way that thinking Japanese government versus the Marine Corps. What was the attitude of the Japanese government towards the airport at Sendai?
You have to remember that the disaster was simply so big and over such a big area that this was a real challenge. It would be for any government to deal with. The Sendai airport had gotten hit by a wave that was probably 15 feet high and just swept over everything. And you saw how I described it once the waters receded. They had pretty much written off Sendai airport that would ever function again.
Well, some members of our audience know that the Marine Corps is an expeditionary force, and kind of a little bit of equipment and different approach to things. What did the Marines say when they saw that airport?
What I'm told is that when our engineers got up and other staff officers went up and flew over it in helicopters and then got down for a look, they thought that within a fairly short time, a matter of days, they could get the airport functioning again. This isn't to say it would take passengers any time, but you would be able to land fixed-wing aircraft to bring in a lot of supplies.
But once that took place, then you had a operations center for relief activities, coordinated with Air Force, Marine Corps, to bring supplies in for the whole region. Is that how it became a real center of operations, something like that?
That's right. It was the Marines, the Army, and the U.S. Air Force were able to get this going in a fairly short period of time. It was just a matter of days. And that did serve as a very useful air hub for bringing in supplies.
Okay, paint the picture for us now, Colonel Newsham. What did the rest of the Tohoku region, what was it like there on the ground 2 years ago? If we just run the clock back 2 years, we're now at March 14, it's 3 days after this earthquake hits, or 3 or 4 days. What is it like?
In the affected areas, the ones that had been hit, it looked, if you imagine pictures you have seen of, say, Berlin 1945, that kind of destruction, just masses of debris, crushed vehicles, what looked like bombed out buildings everywhere, and this extended for a period of a length of a few hundred miles actually, and went inland a fair distance. But you also had disruption in things like fuel transportation, electricity cut off, and then you have refugee centers. Very often they were schools in which people whose homes had been destroyed or could not go back were living. And that was, the scale of it was a particularly huge challenge, not to mention many of the civilian officials who would normally look after people in a disaster like that had been killed in the tsunami as well.
This earthquake was the largest reported earthquake in Japanese history. And we'll talk a little bit more about it, as well as the lessons learned and the future when we come back after the break. So stay with us. We are back, we're live, and you can join the conversation by calling us at area code 808-296-5467. This is KGU AM, part of the Wall Street Business Network. And today we're talking about lessons from Fukushima, big changes in Japan's self-defense forces on the roughly 2-year anniversary of the Great Tohoku earthquake. And our guest in the studio with us is Colonel Grant Newsham, United States Marine Corps, the U.S. military liaison officer to Japan's self-defense forces, ground self-defense forces. I thank you for correcting me with that. And so, Grant, right before the break, we were talking about the kind of the picture of the way that this disaster unfolded. And let's, for the benefit of the listeners, let's jump just for a moment up to the Iwate Prefecture. What did the tsunami look like at that location?
Well, it had happened before I got there, so I didn't actually see it. But looking at obviously the TV coverage of it, but also looking at what had happened, the results of it, it was clear that in certain areas, depending on the geography, it was about 100 feet high.
100 feet high?
It had to be, and it got pushed up according to the geography.
And so those of us in Hawaii who are familiar with the big waves on the North Shore or on Maui as an example, you know, if you look at those waves and could follow them side view, you get basically a moving speed bump. It's a hump. And how is the tsunami different than a hump?
It's sort of like the tide coming up really quickly and coming in really fast, but with a big black wall of stuff, the debris, the trees, the
refrigerators and broken cars, and
that's what's coming.
Broken glass, all that, at 100 feet high.
In some places.
Okay. Thousands of people lost their lives. What's the number?
It's about 20,000.
20,000. Well, let's shift back now to the few hours or maybe a day after the incident happens. Japanese Navy, they arrive on the scene.
That's right, yes. The Maritime Self-Defense Force responded very quickly, like as the Ground Self-Defense Force did too, but the Maritime Self-Defense Force got up to Tohoku very quickly and tried to give as much aid as they could.
Okay, so they're loaded with supplies. They arrive, they are ships, and so, ladies and gentlemen, if you visualize this now, you have your equipment, supplies on board a ship. What's the problem?
The problem is that...
was the problem? For
this sort of disaster relief, a specialized kind of shipping, a specialized kind of know-how is required. And you have to be able to carry supplies, equipment, fuel, water, food in large quantities by sea. But the important part is you have to be able to get it to shore. You
got to connect it.
That's right. So in addition to having to have the right kind of specialized amphibious ships, you have also got to have a way to get it from ship to shore.
Did they have any way then?
Not as well as it could have been.
Okay, okay. So they had some light helicopter.
That's right. They have some smallish helicopters. They had some hovercrafts that were useful, but they did not have really the adequate types or numbers of amphibious vehicles that you would use for these ship-to-shore connectors, is what we call them. Additionally, amphibious ships, they didn't have enough of those ready or available to go. So then there is a big difference between a sort of a combatant ship and an amphibious ship. And a combatant ship has a specific role, which is combat. An amphibious ship carries things and people. And there's a big difference, both in terms of what they can do, but also how you employ them.
Okay, so what we have, folks, is a situation where the Japanese Navy responds quickly. They've got supplies and materials. And to use the old Vermont farmer expression, they're looking ashore and they say, you can't get there from here.
Yes.
Something like that.
They were close, but you have got to be able to bridge that gap, especially when the ports have been destroyed.
And in addition to the destruction of the ports, the pier, in a lot of situations, there was a sea of debris and junk between the ship and wherever it was they had to go, right?
That was one of the problems, yes.
Okay, so as a consequence of that situation, Colonel Newsham, if we could have flipped it around the other way, or maybe I don't know how's the best way to answer this question, how many lives could have been saved?
It's an extrapolation based on the Marine Corps' experience during Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, where, really owing to the foresight of some good Marine NCOs, they had 4 AAVs, amphibious assault vehicles, ready to go. And they put these into action immediately after the floods hit in Katrina, and they each saved about 100 lives. That's been documented. Had the self-defense forces had this particular piece of equipment, and this is not even mentioning the know-how required to use to do an amphibious operation. If they just had the equipment, it could have gone into many places and rescued people. And I think it's a fair guess at around 3,000 to 4,000 lives might have been saved with the right equipment and the right know-how.
So these 20,000 lives that were lost in this great Tohoku earthquake, these were people who died how?
Well, obviously, the majority of them were smothered immediately or in very short order. But there's always a number who survive.
Right.
But they are unable to flee any further. And keep in mind, it was below freezing. And those are the people that you could have saved a number of them.
Okay. So those other people that weren't immediately smothered, they basically froze to death.
That's the way to put it. They froze to death probably within the first 24 to 48 hours.
Okay, let's see if we could take the fast forward on the DVD here as an example and roll into your the lesson learned. I'm sure there were several, but focusing on this lack of a connector. And the connector is the amphibious equipment as well as the know-how, software, hardware combination. What is happening today that you are involved in with the Japanese ground self-defense forces?
Well, first off, and I'll just some context. To conduct an amphibious operation, it requires being able to effectively combine and coordinate your air, sea, and ground capability. So you have to have the Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps all working together properly. Okay. And that is a fundamental requirement. Now, the Marine Corps and the U.S. Navy, which are a team, we've been working on this for 70, 80 years. So we've
got it down.
Well,
almost.
We do it better than most people. I think if you ever think you've got it down, you can expect some.
I stand corrected. Okay.
But we do better than most, this is information which we have, know-how which we have.
Okay.
And it's we are making an effort to make this information available and to try and explain how we do things, so that this is a useful skill, capability.
Okay, sure.
That we'd like if the Japanese self-defense forces are interested, we're glad to make it available.
So your position as the liaison officer for the United States Marine Corps with the Japanese ground self-defense forces is a large piece of the work that you're doing, or the focus of the work that you're doing, if I can put it that way, is involved in what?
Well, obviously, sort of a channel for information, information flow back and forth, obviously. I can obviously have been around long enough, have some ideas about what ought to be done and how one might go about it. But it'd be best to look at me as a sort of a window from which you can get information, and information flows back as well.
You are encouraging and supporting their development to try to create this connector.
That's right.
The missing piece.
And I was even looking at, before I came on the show, I was looking at some notes I had written in Sendai about 6 days after I got there. And one of the things I wrote down was, we have a chance to create this capability, and it's indispensable. Had we had it, we'd have saved a lot of lives.
Let me jump to the DVD again, hit the fast forward button. Looking down the road, let's assume that this is ultimately put into place, this connector, and you know, I know you don't want me to say this, but for the audience purposes, essentially Japan is looking at or taking steps in the direction of creating something like a Marine Corps-like operation within the Japanese ground self-defense forces.
That's
yes?
correct.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Good. All right. We'll continue with this and some of the ramifications for this after the break. So stay with us. We are back. We are live, and you can join the conversation by calling us at area code 808-296-5467. Our show today: lessons from Fukushima. Big changes in Japan's ground self-defense forces. Our special guest is the U.S. military liaison officer to the Japan ground self-defense forces, Colonel Grant Newsham, United States Marine Corps. And right before the break, we were starting to talk about the development and work that Grant is doing in assisting the Japanese ground self-defense forces in their effort to develop an amphibious capability, both in terms of the mental software as well as the hardware. We ended right before the break with a question that I put to Colonel Newsham about, basically the bottom line is that Japan is moving in the direction of creating something like a Marine Corps capability within its own military.
That's correct. It is a Marine-like capability.
Okay.
It's not a Marine Corps, but a Marine-like capability, which is it's a significant distinction.
You Marines are a very special, unique group, and don't like anybody to come too close to you in terms of copying. But
oh no, you can never have too many Marines. But in this case, capability is fine.
Okay, all right. I understand we have a caller on the line. Is that individual with us? Who is this? Okay, Karen, great to hear from you again. Do you have a comment or a question that you want to put to Colonel Newsham? Wait. Karen, hold on a second. Post-occupied Japan. So the first part of your question is, you're asking Colonel Newsham because your phone call is breaking up a little bit on us here. The first part of your question is whether he thinks that the development of this amphibious capability was hindered in the development of the Japanese self-defense forces in the post-occupied Japan period? Okay, so Japanese self-defense forces created as a peacekeeping force. Was that fact a hindrance in the development of this amphibious capability?
Where it was a drawback and was in the difficulty the Japanese self-defense forces had in operating jointly. And what that means is, once again, combining air, sea, and ground capabilities. There's traditionally and historically have been some big barriers between inter-service cooperation. This is not peculiar to Japan, though there are historic reasons for it. But if you go back to 1983 in Grenada, where the U.S. forces had a very hard time operating effectively in a joint manner, the Japanese had the same problem when Tohoku hit, when the earthquake hit. You really have to, and given that, you have to really appreciate just how well they did, going from a standing start to within hours being able to get into the area. So, yeah, they have some problems owing to the difficulties operating jointly, but they recognize these, and this is something which can be can be improved.
Okay. Well, okay, so let's restate the question from Karen to make sure that you and I both understand it, because that is a really superb question. So Karen, you got to help me with this now, okay? As I understand your question, you stated that you come from a Marine family, and you associate the word Marine with the fiercest warriors in the United States. Yes? And so that when I use the term Marine-like, you're saying that is a contradiction in the peacekeeping foundation for the Japanese self-defense forces that were set up in post-war Japan. Okay, and so then the question becomes, as they develop this Marine-like capability, isn't there an internal contradiction there? Okay. Okay. Okay, let's let Karen, if you wouldn't mind taking the answer from Colonel Newsham offline, and thank you for calling.
Okay, I will just say one thing, that you will note that the Marines, part of what we do is fight, but the Marines on Okinawa, for example, spend about at least 2 or 3 times a year do a very serious, a lot of humanitarian assistance, disaster relief operations throughout the region. In fact, one person has noted that in the last 50 years, the Marines have saved a lot more lives in Asia than they've taken. Interesting. Okay. So we have another caller from our live studio audience here. Question?
Colonel Newsham, yes, good. Thank you for your appearance on the show today. Quick question is, okay, so the Marines are opening Sunday Airport. The Japanese don't have a well-developed amphibious capability, but there are the Marines are in Japan. There's 20,000 of them. They do have an amphibious capability. So was that used for the airport? How was that employed to assist the people of Japan?
Actually, the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, which is about 2,000 Marines and 3 or so Navy ships, amphibious ships, did get employed up in the northern part of the affected zone on an island called Oshima. They were able to land Marines, supplies, equipment, generators, and go to work, and spent about a week cleaning up and being helpful up there. It was a perfect demonstration of combining air, sea, and ground capabilities.
Okay.
So this was Marines and U.S. Navy working together on this. It was a textbook case, and it was noticed by some people in the self-defense forces.
Great questions. Let's go back to our topic about our previous discussion, Colonel Newsham, about we're looking down the road. I don't know what the time distance is, but let's assume, for purposes of this discussion, that Japan has created this amphibious capability, this connector between the Navy and the shore. They've got the software, they've got the hardware. What does that do to their internal capability vis-a-vis any kind of disaster response?
Well, it certainly gives you the ability to respond effectively to a major disaster, and there's an absolute certainty Japan will experience more of them. It also gives you the opportunity to sort of build some confidence in the capability of the self-defense forces, and this was one of the real outcomes of the Tohoku, the relief effort, was the self-defense force image in the mind of the majority of Japanese people. Finally, for the first time, they were seen as doing something valuable for the country.
What was their image before? Kind of a gutless group that doesn't really do anything?
Oh, I wouldn't put it quite in those terms, but it was really just not immediately clear what they did do. Perhaps as a constabulary or a National Guard or something. It was just seen really something.
So the Japanese people really got to see them in action, and they were worth something.
They certainly were, and that is something that I'm not sure it's gotten stressed enough in the focus on Operation Tomodachi, is that the vast majority of the relief effort was done by the self-defense forces, with the ground self-defense forces taking the lead, maritime self-defense forces doing a lot as well, and the Americans kind of fell in on that and helped where we could.
You know, I want to move into, let's hit the fast forward button again. We're looking down into the future. I want to ask you to do a little bit of a crystal ball approach, Colonel Newsham here, and look on the international level now, as Japan has developed this capability in the future. What is it going to mean for our region of the world in terms of humanitarian assistance or disaster relief, if Japan can begin to participate in a different way with this type of connector amphibious capability? Long question, I know. Long.
It would be a huge contribution. Japan has got a contribution to make. They've got a very sizable defense force, extremely skillful. They've got most of the hardware that you need for this capability, and they could, in very short order, put together an ad hoc capability. But this is something which Japan could put to very good use throughout the region, where there's regularly there are natural disasters.
Sure.
It's also not realized that the Japanese self-defense forces already participated in a number of these events.
Like, for instance, where?
Most recently in Haiti, in the Caribbean.
Okay.
They did very well, worked very well with the Marines, did a lot of good. In Pakistan a few years ago. And even after the Indonesia tsunami in 2004, the self-defense forces sent down ships, helicopters, and personnel. So they've gotten a long way beyond the checkbook diplomacy they were criticized for 20 years ago. And when the Japanese do make this contribution, it is a huge tangible benefit. And when they are filling a need which cannot be met by someone else, or it allows other resources to be used on some other project. But for the Japanese to get involved regionally in humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, would be a huge contribution in its own right, but also would do, I think, a lot for Japan's image, both externally and internally as well.
Well, this development of an amphibious capability and what it would do internally for Japan is a topic we'll pick up on after the break. So, ladies and gentlemen, stay with us. Lessons from Fukushima, big changes in Japan's ground self-defense forces. We'll be back.
You're listening to Asia in Review Thursday on the Think Tech radio series here on AM 760 KGU. Now here once again is your host, David Day.
We are back, we are live, and we're talking about lessons from Fukushima, big changes in Japan's ground self-defense forces with Colonel Grant Newsham, United States Marine Corps, the U.S. military liaison officer to Japan's ground self-defense forces in Honolulu, in the studio live from Tokyo. Colonel Newsham, right at the break, we were talking about the enormous contribution you were projecting and predicting that Japan could make to disaster relief and humanitarian assistance around the Asia-Pacific region once they had this amphibious capability in place. And you started to kind of hint at internal benefit in being, or internal benefits to Japan in being able to do that. What did you have in mind when you said that? A confidence builder or something like that?
Yeah, well, it's something of an imprecise calculus. But to the extent that Japan does not see itself as insular, but as a regular country that makes a sort of disproportionate contribution to human well-being, that is by definition a good thing. It also sees itself perhaps as less dependent on others for its defense or for its defense activities.
You know, Japan is known for its relatively generous in years past checkbook diplomacy. And that is, there would be a problem or a crisis in some part of the world, and they would supply money and supplies, material maybe, but checkbook diplomacy. And what you're suggesting is that a different type of Japanese involvement, maybe in addition to or in lieu of, where they actually show up on the dirt.
That's right, and as I noted earlier, that they've already done this. So the precedent is there. They perform extremely well. I would note they're probably Asia's most capable military.
Incredible. Really, that's kind of a surprising statement for... What do you mean by that? Asia's most capable military.
Well, they've got the parts.
Okay.
If you look at the individual self-defense force units, that they are extremely high quality. The quality of recruits and officers and troops that they have, very serious, diligent, very well-educated, intelligent people, and they've shown this repeatedly in their ability to operate. One of the challenges, as noted, is the ability to operate together. Is the key to successful operations. And I'll go back to this point that an amphibious operation is the ability to properly coordinate and put together air, sea, and ground capabilities, particularly to move resources from ship to shore, or vice versa.
And maybe related to that point is, if we look at the United States, doesn't the various branches of the armed services, don't they practice exercises with FEMA and coordinating for humanitarian relief and disaster relief within the United States?
They do. In Japan, there is not really an equivalent of FEMA. The relief is done more at a local level, and they've got a lot of good practice and preparation because of particularly the earthquake fear. But the Tohoku incident was simply so catastrophic that it did just destroy a lot of the plans they had in place.
For localized relief operations. In other words, it wiped out the city hall or whatever the connector piece was for that, or centerpiece for that area.
That's right, and the information flow which they were expecting, whereas you would have local officials report what they needed through a particular chain, the self-defense forces would reply. That really broke down not surprisingly. So that was an extra challenge.
In the aftermath, and I maybe I've misspoken throughout this whole program. I've used the word Fukushima which is the common reference to this entire disaster, and I know that applies perhaps more appropriately to the nuclear challenge, and that I should have been using the Great Tohoku earthquake and Tohoku throughout, so we don't get it confused with the nuclear challenge. But in the wake of this terrible disaster, do you see yet the development of something like our FEMA starting in Japan, or talking about it, or not yet?
I would say not yet, but there are some very promising signs, and I would cite, particularly at the prefectural level, where you have some very good initiatives to develop in advance the ability to respond to serious natural disaster and to cooperate with national resources, and also to cooperate with U.S. forces.
Okay.
And I would cite Shizuoka Prefecture, just to the west of Tokyo, as a very good example, very imaginative, and really a lot of initiative to prepare. And that was one of the lessons from the Tohoku problem, was that there had not been enough preparation ultimately, even between the Japanese self-defense forces, but also between the self-defense forces and the U.S. forces. There had not been enough prior preparation. And the more you plan for something in advance, the more you practice it, the better you'll be at it.
You know, you said something interesting that had not occurred to me. I kind of assumed that with 20,000 or so Marines on Okinawa, that there would have been a lot of coordination and exercise as between the Marines and U.S. Marines and the Japanese self-defense forces, right?
Well, there's always been some. There hasn't been as much as there should be, and it has tended to take place in a sort of a parallel track. But the real interoperability, that is late. The Maritime Self-Defense Force and the U.S. Navy are the exception, of course, which we envy. But there is there is certainly a need for improved, what we call interoperability, the ability to operate together. And that was one of the shortcomings that was highlighted by the Tohoku action.
And that shortcoming is at least partially remedied, or a step taken in remedying that shortcoming by your position as the U.S. military or U.S. Marine Corps liaison officer. Yes?
That's correct. And that's one small role in this, is to actually create the connections, which will lead to that sort of interoperability.
All right, we have time for just about one more quick question here, and that is this. You know, I've talked throughout this program about fast forward, look in your crystal ball. Given your background in this whole situation in assisting or encouraging, supporting Japan's creation of this connector, a marine-like operation or capability, how far away from operations are they?
Japan's got about 80% of the hardware necessary.
Okay.
There's just a couple pieces missing. What they lack really is what I would call the software, the know-how. But that is something that, you know, with the Marines and the Navy, we've got years of experience. That's fairly easily taught. So I would say realistically that probably within about a year and a half they could have an ad hoc capability. Of course, to perfect it takes a good long while, but to say an ad hoc capability is well within range.
You know, Colonel Newsham, I really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us for this program, and I know on behalf of our audience, we want to thank you for your service to our country. And in addition, I think all of our listeners can appreciate the work that you are doing is a tremendous contribution in enhancing the alliance between the United States and Japan, and we thank you for that. And I take my hat off to you, even though I'm not wearing one.
Well, thank you very much. It's indeed a pleasure to be here today.
And we'll be looking forward to seeing these developments. And unfortunately, I was going to say we'll be looking forward to the next disaster in the region. Look forward is not the right word, because we know it's going to happen. And it'll be fascinating to see the thinking, the encouragement, and the support that you have been providing to the Japanese ground self-defense forces in some future place, whether it is in Indonesia or in Thailand, one of the South Pacific islands, and I think that'll be exciting to see that place, that peace come into place. This has been a kind of a fascinating, very fascinating program for me, and I just appreciate the work that you've done so much. And